Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are around the world. As most of you know, my name is Andy Fell, the founder of Gift 631, the events brand What Winners Do. And tonight, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending wherever you are, we have a real pleasure and a real privilege. So today, Phil McVeigh is going to actually be interviewing the wonderful Steve Smith. And Phil and I knew each other from when I first came to Australia, actually. We're on different sides of Australia. For those that don't know Australia, Phil is about a 5-hour plane ride from where I am. I'm in the Gold Coast on Australia's east. Phil's in Perth on Australia's west. And we had a period working together within the Westpac group. Phil is a truly outstanding leader who really cares about his people, cares about his customers, and cares about the community in which he operates. And then we obviously moved on and went our separate ways, although we've always been connected. And today, Phil is going to have a conversation with the amazing Steve Smith. Now, Steve is a really, really important guy to me. Now, he may not be fully aware of this, actually, but Steve, first of all, reconnected me with my absolute hero, who's a guy called Frank Dick, who was a British athletics coach in the 1990s. And Frank was the first person to really inspire me to what I do today. If it wasn't for Frank Dick, I would not be a conference speaker. And it was Steve that really put myself in touch with the amazing Frank Dick, for which I will always be grateful. Secondly, just as I was leaving the UK, actually, Steve wrote an article. This was my parting gift for everyone in the UK. It was my 2009 Guide to Winning. And Steve very kindly contributed an article for that, which was my leaving gift for all of the team when I left RBS NatWest Mortgages. And then thirdly, Steve and I met in London for a conversation not too long after I'd left RBS. And that conversation has been in my head ever since. And I set up a business in the UK called Expect to Win on the back of that conversation. Then I moved to Australia, went back into the corporate world, but always had that conversation in the back of my mind, which is why ultimately I now have the portfolio of businesses that I have. But without further ado, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to pass you across to the amazing Phil McVeigh, who's going to take the conversation from here. Phil, over to you, mate.
Andy, thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to everybody in the community. I've been asked by Andy to speak a little slower than I normally do. I'm not sure that subtitle function is going to be available, and you're going to need it not just for me, but also for Steve, who is from the Irish capital of Liverpool. So we're going to look forward to hearing his accent as well. I just thought I'd set a little bit of context first before I ask Steve to do his own bio. I think he will do it way more justice than I. First of all, Andy, a privilege to host. Awesome to be working together again with you on all of the fun stuff, actually, that we used to talk about. Really, my job is purely as a host. I'm going to kick off with some questions, but I know that the community always ask awesome questions and are itching to do so. But first of all, we wanted to hear the background story, the bio from Steve himself. So Steve, a very warm welcome. It's awesome to be able to play this small role in hosting, and we'd love to hear in the community about who is Steve Smith and a little bit about your background, please.
Okay, hello everyone. Andy, thanks so much for that kind introduction, and I'm sure that you were over-exaggerating any type of influence I could possibly have on somebody like yourself. But I do appreciate it, and it's good to know that those little moments stay, because they shape us, don't they? So it's brilliant, and thanks for hosting this, Phil. It's incredible that we're able to do it. We're going to talk a little bit about change, how adaptation, and how everybody's had to evolve over the course of the last 2 years. And you know what, this is one of the most incredible parts of that, the fact that we're able to do this and spread it around the world. So yeah, my background is a little bit checkered. So unlike I'm guessing most people in the room, probably the biggest thing for me is I've never really been employed. I've always been involved in corporate life, but I've always kind of been sat on the self-employed side of it. So the first side of my self-employment, or my first career, I suppose, was as an international athlete. So spanned from 93 through to 96. I competed in the men's high jump, which is not exactly the glamour event of international sport. Well, I think it is, but you know what, I'm sure you don't. But it was, it was amazing to travel the world, to compete in front of 100,000 people. Competed in 2 Olympic Games. Was fortunate enough to take an Olympic medal. I have a British record that still stands 29 years after I set it. So that's really great for me to be able to look back on that. It's not great when I look back on the haircuts and the shorts, but it is nice to look back and think, shit, I was once a really good athlete, and it does seem like a world away, but you know, it's nice to have done that. Following that, I retired when I was really young, so I was 27. So if you think about the life of an international athlete, most athletes will compete until they're kind of 31, 32. So think about the guy that won the Olympic Games the year that I got a bronze, I think he went on to about 33. I ruptured my Achilles tendon when I was 26, and that was the last time I competed. So very quickly you need to reinvent yourself. I probably made what was not the wisest decision at the time to go into the restaurant industry. So I was involved in a couple of restaurants in Liverpool, owned and operated them for 3-4 years. But in 2004, met with one of my current business partners, and who loved his personal development. And we had an opportunity to set up something which we were both passionate about. And at that point, we set up a company called Raise the Bar. Raise the Bar have now been operating since 2004 with a leadership development business that has 3 main arms. So first part of it is we're one of the UK's largest speaker bureaus. So we have access to inspirational people from all around the globe, 700 thought leaders. We deliver bespoke leadership and management programs. And we also deliver leadership and management apprenticeships, which for those of you in the UK, you'll be aware of what they look like. But for those of you not in the UK, it's basically an Institute of Leadership and Management qualification, a really extensive qualification for managers in the UK. And like any other business, one of the reasons why we're passionate about it, and I think that we're busy, is that a lot of technical experts get promoted to be managers without really the training to go out there and be great managers. So we expect them to be great managers because they've been great at the job. So we help to kind of bridge that gap and give them the skills, the confidence to be able to go out there and lead and manage. So that is that's me, Phil. So that was hopefully that served its purpose.
And most importantly, I think everyone will be interested in which football team. More of that later.
It depends on the audience, really. No, I'm not that shallow. I'm a season ticket holder at Everton, which is. Well, I think we're going to talk a little bit about resilience later on in the session, Phil, and you certainly need resilience to support Everton.
Indeed. Well, let's wind the clock right back, Steve, if you'll indulge me. One of the questions I'm always interested in, particularly when you're dealing with people who've been very successful in multiple things and ventures, are champions born or are they made? Interested in how you grew up. When did you realize that you were good at high jump? How did you actually figure out that this is something that you could be ultra successful in?
So I'm kind of, working class family. No one from our university really went on to didn't go to university. That kind of evolution of a family. So I was never ever pushed. Just supported, really, from my mum and dad, which is really important to me. So I could have left school at 15 and they would have been happy. It's so but for me, I was one of those kids who really enjoyed sports, but I wasn't brilliant in any particular sport until I found athletics. I found athletics because my sister used to go to the track in Liverpool, and of course, my dad would drop her off, so I get dropped off as well, and I did all of the sports. But like any I suppose 11, 12, 13-year-olds, you head for the high jump map because it's the coolest place to hang around, to have play fights and jump over a bar and and just mess around. And I loved it. I just loved high jump, and I love this piece around, you put the bar on 1.20 meters, and you just have to figure out how to get over it. right? And you jump it and it fails, and you come back, and then you try and do it again, and then it's great because you're on your own, you against the bar, and then you put the bar off 5 centimeters yourself, and you try it again. You go through the same process, and I just love that physical barrier of, you know, and then coming home and, you know, putting it on the wall, and this is what I jumped, and then, you know, the next time I went to try and get higher and higher, and it's really nice because it's a really visible sport. So, you know, it's interesting because we were just talking about Paul's business earlier on, Paul Matic, and I always use examples from recruitment when I talk about the kind of the similarities of the visibility of kind of sales roles and this kind of this piece around you know, the how you respond to failure, where, you know, how you come back stronger the next time, you know, this visibility around where do I sit on the overall, you know, if I jump to 150, I know exactly where I'm ranked in the country. Even back then when you had to get a magazine called Athletics Weekly, now you can Google it, yeah? But every Thursday, I could tell you exactly where I was in the country. In the same way that when we look at our sales teams, you know, it's really visible. You know where you are. You know who's nailing it. You know what the benchmark is. You know what great looks like. You know what you're aiming towards. You may only be at the bottom of it, but that gap's really clear that you can work on. So I love that about going, shit, look at those guys in the Olympics. And look what they're jumping, and they're jumping a height to the ceiling. And I'm only here, but what do I need to do to get from here to there? And it's small chunks. And it's just a really, really good visible sport, you against the bar, to work in that way. So that's what I loved about it. And those incremental kind of gains each year were really visible for me. So it was an easy sport to get dragged into for me.
When did you realize I could be really good at this? I could be ultra competitive. Clearly, if you're looking at the weekly results at 15, that is an indicator that there might have been some inherent competition.
Yeah, well, what happened is I was 14, and in England there's a competition called the English Schools Championships, and I qualified for the English Schools Championships. I've got no idea, you know, how I did that because I didn't really know what the English Schools Championships were. And I turned up for this competition in Birmingham. It was quite a big deal. It was at the Alexander Stadium in Birmingham, which is going to host the Commonwealth Games, the next Commonwealth Games. So, and I won this competition, and I didn't have any high jump spikes. It was just in my sprint spikes. And at the time, I didn't have a coach either. And I came off, and somebody said, you know that you're now the best 14-year-old in the country. And I was like, really? And my mum and dad went, really? Is that what that means? And we kind of said, shit, we better get a coach then, yeah? So we went back and had a coach, and so I showed that early talent, but actually the height that I won it with, you know, it was quite a low height when you compare the kind of 15-year-old competition since. So it was nothing that would say he's an outstanding talent, he's going to go to the games, blah blah blah. Although I was the best 14-year-old, there's lots of great 14-year-olds out there. So I knew I had a talent then, but then, you know, from that point onwards, I probably really made my breakthrough in a couple of years later when I was 17, and I made the Great Britain team when I was a 17-year-old. But I was behind this really precocious talent, this guy called Brendan Riley, who was kind of my nemesis. He was always the guy who was on the front cover of Athletics Weekly, which is that was my sole goal, to be on the front cover of Athletics Weekly. But it was always Brendan. It was always him. He was the golden boy. So I was always chasing him down, and I overtook him when I was 19. But it's another great metaphor from sport. I think, you know, it's a lot easier to chase, I think, sometimes. And Frank Dick talks about this, you know, when you're setting the pace and reinvent yourself and, you know, always pushing the boundaries of what's possible, you know, the guy right behind you chasing all the time has always got that added bit of, you know, motivation to get to you. And that's the way I always felt with Brendan. You know, he always had this scouser on his back all the time, waiting to take the limelight. And that was, and then from there it went on. There was a guy called Dalton Grant, who was our number one in the country at that time. And he held the British record. And then that was my goal, to beat him and to set the British record. And then it's about Olympics and, you know, medals. And so always chasing that next moment. And
what was the date that you appeared first on the front cover of Athletics Weekly?
I can't remember, actually. I always resented it because it was a lot longer after I should have. You know, I'm just going to leave that there. You
know, in the research for this piece, I found an article in the Liverpool Echo on the 16th of June, 2001, said, "Some of the best careers are built on failure." Steve Smith said, "Interested to hear what happened to you and how did you respond and bounce back?"
Yeah, I mean, going back to that original point around failure. So, high jump is built on failure. You're always, attack the bar, try something different, fail, try something different, fail. It goes back to that whole piece of it. It's what you learn from failure. There's lots of cliches out there. Yeah, it's if you listen to any kind of tech entrepreneur, they'll use phrases like, fail fast, fail fast. But failure is all about, for me, being able to look at failure without emotion, learn from it and come back stronger. So it's all about being able to look at it as just an outcome and analyze, okay, what do I need to change? What do I need to do different? But anybody who's ever been in that failure situation, whether that is, changing job roles, setting up a business, delivering a shit presentation, being bottom of the sales ranking, whatever that is, will know that there's a huge amount of failure a huge amount of emotion that's attached to it. But when you're in the Olympic Games and you're competing in front of 100,000 people and you've got 3 attempts and you fail, it's just an outcome, because 5 minutes later, you've got to be back and you've got to have taken the crucial things from it. And you can't afford to be thinking, well, my mum and dad's in the stand and, I'll let them down, or I've let my country down, or, or woe is me, or, the world's against me and that guy's better and he's got more of the. No, you've just got to deal with it as an outcome, learn from it, commit to it and go again. And if you fail again, then you fail again. But that's quite a difficult thing to do. And it's interesting because one of my favorite authors is a guy called Steve Peters, who's author of The Chin Paradox, which some of you might know the book, some of you might not. And Steve talks a lot about how we respond to failure and how we can become really catastrophic about it. When we're faced with failure, we start to think much more black and white. We become paranoid about our failures, about our insecurities. We go on a downward spiral. But if you think in a logical, rational way about failure, and if you prepare for things, leaving nothing behind, then you can deal with it very differently. And again, I was listening to a podcast with Matthew Mahoney recently, where he talks about not leaving crumbs. And what that is, it's about doing everything that you need to, so you can look back and you can go, well, at least I give it my best shot. There's nothing that can come back to me and haunt me later. And that's one of the key things about failure, because if I go to the Olympic Games and I've laid out the foundations for performance, I've got all of my controllables in place and I've committed to them and I've done them 100%. Then if I go out and I fail, at least it is what it is. I couldn't have done any more. But if I go out there and I go, well, maybe I could have trained better. Maybe I could have got a better person on my team. Maybe I could have worked my nutrition a bit better. Maybe could have, would have, could have, should have, another Frank Dick phrase. Yeah. All those things, that's what's going to send me into an emotional downward spiral. But if I know that I've got all my process goals in place, I've done all the things I need to, I go out, then of course I can just build on it. And you know what? It's much easier to remove the emotion from it. So Steve talks about something called a chimp brain, which is your limbic system, fight, flight, or freeze. When you're in that kind of catastrophic mode, that's what's talking. But he also talks about then your human brain, which is your frontal cortex, which he says that's the part of your brain which is based on logic, rationality. It's based on truth, and that's the part of the brain that you engage when you're trying to respond from failure. Because that's the one that says, I've trained as hard as I possibly can. That's the one that says, I've got as good a chance as anybody. Logically, I'm ranked 4th in the world. I've got a good chance to get a medal. All that type of stuff that you focus on. And just to finish off on failure, I always use a quote from Michael Jordan, which I'm sure you all know, which is I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game shot and missed. I've failed over and over again in my life, and that's the reason why I succeed. Right? And when you go out there and you step outside your comfort zone, then that's where things happen. That's where you move quickly. That's where you respond. That's where where you get growth, when you're outside of your comfort zone, facing those failures.
Steve, awesome. Thanks so much for that answer. I noticed on your business website, Raise the Bar, your business motto is simply to inspire. I'm really interested in who inspired you when you were coming up through the ranks, both from high jump and business, and why did they inspire you?
So there's probably a number of people. So I grew up in, just looking at everybody in the audience, there'll be some people who don't remember some of these names, but I grew up watching your Daley Thompsons and your Seb Cowes and your people like the great British athletes, and also, Dalton was, he held the British record when I started. Dalton was great because he gave me something to aim at all the time. I first watched him compete in the Seoul Olympics, and I was like, I just want to, I want to do what he does. So that was a great inspiration for me. Frank Dick was great. I mean, going back to Andy's point, I sat as a 17-year-old underneath the Helsinki Olympic Stadium in my first ever international, surrounded by all these legends of the sport. It was the first time I'd ever been abroad, and here I am, this long-haired Scouser in the Olympic Stadium in Helsinki, and you've got Frank delivering this speech about the mountain and the valley men people. And shivers going down my spine, and kind of going, wow. Most of the other people around me were going, I've heard this speech about 20 times now. So maybe they didn't have the same inspiration, but for me, and Frank was great with that. Then on a business side, probably the main person I always come back to is Steve Jobs. I'm a product person. I love products, and from a that's why I love management apprenticeships. That's why I love speakers. That's why I love our Change Catalyst program. We develop great products and make them look and feel as good as we possibly can. And after reading Steve Jobs' book, and he talks about simplicity, for me, that's always my mantra. It's always about providing products that look, feel great, and feel aspirational. So he's or was an inspiration for me. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of people throughout my life that have been, key moments. It's interesting, Andy talking about it. It's these kind of things, that these moments that change the direction of what you're doing and give you a focus. So yeah, that's my inspiration, I think.
And going back to the Olympic medal, with the pinnacle, I guess, of your career, I'm really interested in the goal setting process. You've got 4 years and 4 years prep for one event every 4 years. How do you mentally set yourself up? What's your process for goal setting, particularly when many people on here will be dealing with pipeline businesses? This seems to be like the ultimate long tail pipeline.
So it's interesting because, if I just talk about the corporate environment for a second before I go on to mine, we had quite a long conversation about Andy's days at RBS and Paul's days at RBS. And I always remember they had a very clear 4-year vision, 4 years of where we're going to be most admired and all this type of thing, right? Organizations, for me, can't afford to have a 4-year goal now. Things have changed. The world moves at such a rapid pace. So that's the first thing that I would say. It's very difficult for anyone to set a 4-year goal at the moment. But from an Olympic perspective, it's really easy. So it's very black or white for me. It's a 4-year goal. And back then as well, it was interesting. I was watching a BBC program recently called Gold Rush, and it was the lead up to the Olympic Games. And it tells the story of the Olympic Games in Atlanta, and sorry for being UK centric here, but it tells the story of the Great Britain Olympic team and their journey from the Atlanta Olympics, which is the games that I competed in, to the Olympic Games in London, where they achieved record-breaking performances. And they labelled the Olympic Games in Atlanta the team of shame, right? And I'm sat there on my couch thinking, I was part of the team of shame. I got a bronze medal, right? And but we only got 13 medals. 15 medals in those games, as opposed to, I think, 69 medals or 59 medals in London. And typically they made a dramatic, kind of told a dramatic story and labeled it the team of shame, and airbrushed out performances like myself and Steve Redgrave and people like that who actually got medals. But back then, the point that they were making is the sport wasn't supported. There was no lottery funding. So our athletes, you know, were competing off their own back. They travel the country, to travel the world to pick up appearance fees here or there that would pay for the physio, or pay for the warm weather training, or, you know, pay for, you know, their living expenses and their mortgage and stuff like that. So you had this dual kind of thing going on, trying to be an elite athlete, but also trying to perform. So going back to the goal setting process, the only thing that made a difference to me, the only thing that was going to make a high jumper independently able to support himself was getting a medal in the Olympic Games. Right, World Championships are important, of course they are. European Championships are important. Commonwealth Games are important. But for me, it was always 4 years, and everything was about that moment. So the 4 years was broken down into World Championships, European Championships, Commonwealth Games, and then in between that was broken down into individual competitions. So going to Zurich, Berlin, Oslo, you know, these competitions where I had to make the money. So it was so everything was broken down from the 4 years. And my coach Mike was a statistician. So he was the first person that ever showed me an Excel spreadsheet, right? And I think that's still the reason why I want to put pins in my eyes every time I open one. But he could tell you at any given stage exactly where I was and how I was likely to perform. So because the 4 year plan was broken down in months into weeks, weeks into days, days into individual training sessions, and individual training sessions broken down into specific goals. So this is when I talk about that failure piece, and these are the goals, the controllables that are in your sphere of influence, that he would break it all down to. So how often I went to the gym, what I lifted in the gym, how fast I could run 0 to 30 meters, what my nutrition looked like, all that type of stuff was broken down, and that would give an indication how you like to perform. So the 4 year goal was kind of the performance goal, but you can't control that, because what if somebody breaks a world record? You know, what if you wake up in the morning and you feel like shit? You know, what if? All you can do is focus on the performance, the performance goals on the way towards that. So you have this kind of, right, this is where I want to be, but there's no guarantees, because luck comes into that as well. And then you've got all this stuff that you can control. So I use the analogy at the moment, you know, I always remember when we went into 2008 and the world went pop. And I think at the time, RBS was probably accounted for 60% of our business. You know, our goal was not revenue based. It was to make sure that, you know, more people knew about Raise the Bar than before we went into it. So it was about going out there and just getting out and networking and doing that type of stuff. So your goals kind of change as you evolve. But you know, for me, you know, when we're talking about, okay, these are our financial goals and where we need to be, that's broken down into lots of different areas. So we don't set 4 year goals now. You know, probably 2 years is where we are as a corporate organization. You know, that's how far forward we forecast, because things change too quickly. You know, for us, we're a small business. We have 50 members of staff in our team, but we're so agile because of the size. You know, one of the challenges that you get when you work at corporate organizations, I mean, it's the old phrase, and it's like turning around a tanker to, you know, change direction to make something happen. It's much more difficult. So yeah, you know, it's sport's very black or white, and it's also very easy as well to, you know, close your eyes and visualize exactly what it looks like in sport. You know, stands on the rostrum, your parents in the stands, the medal getting put over your neck, you know, your name up in lights, Steve Smith, bronze medalist, you know, Olympic medalist, whatever that is. You can be completely focused. The real world's sometimes not like that, but there's lots of similarities that can be drawn from it.
It would be remiss of us to skip past that momentous moment. How did it feel standing on the dice? What were you thinking when the medal was placed around your neck?
Well, a huge part of it is relief, because don't forget, I mean, you train 4 years of your life for something, and there's all these things that can go wrong. And in that one moment in 4 years, you're good enough. You know, you're good enough to stand on the roster. Of course, I was going out there to get, you know, ideally to get an Olympic gold, but there's many people who don't get the chance to stand on that roster, who are really, really talented people. And you risk 4 years of your life. I always remember there was a mate of mine, and I won't say who it is, but he was an Olympic athlete. And when the property boom started, he funded it must have been 50, 60 houses or something like that on a Andy. This doesn't go out, does it? Just to be, this is only for members, isn't it? So he funded a lot of houses on credit cards and that type of stuff. Yeah. And he built up this property portfolio, swapping around credit cards and, solar subprime stuff and all that type of thing. And I said, my God, how do you sleep at night? How do you sleep at night the way you're funding this stuff? And he said, you forget that we gambled our whole life on one moment, on one day in the Olympic Games. And he said, and that's the way I look at it. If it all goes pop, then you know what? I'll do something else. I'll reinvent myself. And actually, not that I would do that with my business. And I'm not advocating, recklessness of that type of nature. But it's amazing when you look at it and you go, shit, it was 4 years towards that moment. And I could have been fourth, could have been just off the rostrum. But I was on the rostrum. And so there's a huge amount of relief that goes with that. And then from there, you then think, okay, well, what am I building towards now? What does that now need to look like? What's the next step for me?
What a brilliant perspective. Awesome. And that's it. Precisely the reason why it's so awesome having you here. Let me take you to 1999 then. So you're on to the next stage of planning and you rupture your Achilles. So a little bit about resilience, bouncing back. What happened next?
Yeah, I mean that's tough because I was ranked number one in the world, favorite for the Sydney Olympics, arguably, and yeah, a 1 in a million ruptured Achilles. I won't go into details, but it was pretty nasty at the time. It followed surgery that I'd had previously, and people get back from ruptured Achilles tendons, all the time in sports. It's a long road, but people definitely get back. But when the surgeon says, I've operated on thousands of ruptured Achilles, and this is a 1 in a million rupture, you are not getting back. You kind of go, shit, what am I going to do now? I'm 27. I left university to be a full-time athlete. I've never been employed. All of it, and I'd been injured for the best part of 2 years. I just started to come back on a comeback trail. Just got back to the top of my game, so funds were running out and that type of stuff. And so at that moment there's a big element to look at. What happened is, you just need to put it behind you. You just need to box it off. You just need to put it that side and focus on what's on this side. And the way I did it, which was, I don't know if it's the right thing or the wrong thing, but I cut a lot of ties in athletics and just said, look, you know what, I need to now do something different. And that's why I then went I had a friend who had a restaurant, and we decided that we'd open another one, and that was going to be the journey. But, like anything, and I know there'll be people thinking about, life outside of the corporate environment and what you do. And it all comes back down to, I'm not a huge fan of Simon Sinek, to be fair, but, I do like some of the sound bites, and it is about understanding the why and understanding what you're passionate about and all that type of stuff. And I went into the restaurant game as a means to an end. I wasn't passionate about it. Yeah, I loved having a meal, but I didn't want to spend time in the kitchen, and I just, it was pretty unfulfilling from a being in the moment at that point. It was a great learning curve for me. Absolutely great learning. I mean, what it teaches you about operations, customer service, break even, profit and loss, all that type of stuff is amazing. And I still look back on that time as, it was good. It was good grounding for me. But there's those moments that change your life. So I go back to my, one of my business partners, Jonathan, and it's interesting because one of the great things as well about, and sorry about using the kind of the banking side all of the time, but back in the good old days, the banks used to spend a lot of time on developing the people and supporting them. And it's interesting that what happens when you do that. And one of the people that I was exposed to was a guy called Jack Black, who was an author at the time. And me and my mate Jonathan, he was talking about this guy Jack Black, and a few other people have mentioned it. And we'd been out and had a meal and had a couple of bottles of wine, and we got back to my house, and you remember the old tapes, and we put a tape in, and the two of us sat with a glass of wine and listened to a Jack Black speech, right? And that was when we went, you know what, let's do something together. Let's do something that we're actually really passionate about. Let's do something which is, which inspires, make a difference, all that type of stuff. Kind of woke up the next morning with a hangover and went our separate ways, but then came back together and actually decided to do it. And at that moment, that was a real turning point. Quite honestly, at the moment, I couldn't think of anything worse than listening to a Jack Black tape. It's just not for me at the moment. But at that time, I'm exaggerating there, by the way, you know, it's good stuff, but it's not me at the moment. At that time, that was the inspiration to go, okay, well, let's do something that I'm passionate about. And that's what brought us to Raise the Bar. So that was the journey really from ruptured Achilles tendon to this now.
And Steve, I think I'm speaking on behalf of the community. There are many who have, like Andy, like Paul, taken the risk and made the jump, and many who are now considering and building their plans. What was the hardest part of that transition from professional athlete to running your own business?
Probably the uncertainty. So the uncertainty of where's my next, you know, paycheck coming from, you know, for everybody. I mean, a lot of people, you know, take a package and they get that comfort blanket, you know, for a period. But of course, there's still the uncertainty. You know, I used to, even when I was an athlete, I knew that potentially things could go wrong at any point. And what I used to do is I'd look at my money and I'd say, what have I got in the bank? And I'd say, if I get injured now, how long will that last? You know, how long will that last? I've got 10 months, I've got 11 months, I've got 12 months. And that's the way you kind of live as an athlete. Then when you become, you know, you step into business, the same thing applies. So that uncertainty around the next paycheck is probably the biggest thing that you've got to overcome, you know. And yeah, I mean, however, people's circumstances are very, very different. But that's the one that there's no guarantees with it. But I don't know many people who've made that jump and have been unhappy, you know, who've struggled. You know, we made the leap into businesses that we knew nothing about. Most people make the leap into businesses that they've spent their whole life in, or they've got a good understanding of, or they know what the margins are, or they know what the market opportunity is. So, you know, that will obviously feed into any decisions that people have as well.
And in terms of your values, I just want to call them out actually, because I think they're, having been in many corporates with meandering values, having we care, we dream, we own it, and we win. Wow, they're impressive, action-orientated values. Keen to hear, how did you come up with them?
We are very, very value-driven in our business. You know, we 100%, we live those values. And what happened is about 3 years ago, we put a dream board up in the office, and we it was just a big, you know, whiteboard, and we said to the team, just write on this board what you want this business to look like. What are the things that are important to you? And they all filled it up, and they put photos and stuff on it, and this probably lasted for about a month. I've still got a photo now of, you'll find it on my website, you know, on of all of those words and stuff. And then we rented a big Airbnb in Liverpool, and we took all the team for the day, and we worked through all of those elements of what we wanted the business to look like and what we thought our values would be, and et cetera, et cetera. And we drew those values out of that. And it's interesting because we were only reflecting on it recently, because, you know, back then we had, well, probably 13, 14, maybe 15 members of staff, and now we're, I think, 55. So the team's changed dramatically, but the values are still used all of the time. And we have an internal kind of social media thing. Our CRM's called Zoho. And it's got your Facebook kind of classic thing, and we have our wall of awesomeness. It's a bit cheesy, but our wall of awesomeness is just where we post stuff about well done and isn't this great and look at his feedback and all that type of stuff. And it's always finished off every comment, hashtag we care, hashtag we own, hashtag, you know, whatever that is. So it still lives with us, and they're really important to us. You know, it's certainly not corporate wallpaper.
You can tell that by reading at first glance. And Andy, I'm going to stop talking. I'll go over to the community, but I just want to finish on one thing. Back to Everton Football Club, and yeah, you got to be an optimist to support Everton. But I just want to bring you back to their motto: Nil satis, nisi optimum. Nothing but the best is good enough. And I think you've done Everton and yourself proud today, Steve. I'll hand over to Andy for questions from the community. Thanks a million.
Thanks for hosting, Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Thanks Steve. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. Either raise the hand or pop a question in the chat and I will ask it for you. Steve, just while we're giving people a moment, when we spoke the other day, you were talking about, psychological safety of the people who work within your business. I'd love you just to elaborate on that for the sake of everybody as well, just why people are getting their questions together.
Yeah, I mean, again, the parts of the business that I talked about are, our speaker bureau affords me a lot of contact with some brilliant people, and another guy that I love to spend time with is a guy called Damien Hughes, and Damien's author of something called the High Performance Podcast, and Damien talks about emotional needs, and it links back to the Steve Peters piece. So when Steve talks about you're in a chimp and that 5-5 freeze, limbic system stuff, when we think in a catastrophic emotional way, our emotional needs aren't getting met. Our survival drives aren't being met. Whether it's sex, whether it's food, whether whatever that is. But when you think about emotional needs and psychological safety of how we do that in the workplace, Damien talks about 4 emotional needs. So he talks about how we create a sense of safety, a sense of value, a sense of belonging, and a sense of control within our teams. And if you can meet those 4 emotional needs with your teams, then you don't get people thinking in a 5-5 freeze, chimp, whatever way you want to look at it mentality. You get them thinking in a more human, logical, rational way. But if you think about how the pandemic has affected us, remote working, so how do we create a sense of belonging? We're not there to pat somebody on the back, give them a hug, give them the physical validation of making them feel valued. The pandemic has made us feel completely out of control. We don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what's next week, what the government's going to do, what the virus is going to do, all that type of stuff. And then of course, people are walking around in masks. People are dying around us. Our sense of safety has disappeared too. So all this adds up to our emotional safety feels really, really challenged. So I think it's our job in the workplace then to think about we're dealing with very, very difficult times to lead our teams. But if we use those 4 elements of safety, value, control, belonging, and look to meet those needs, then hopefully our people will be happier. There's a better chance of performance outcomes.
Yeah, brilliant. And we're big fans of Professor Damien Hughes. He's done a couple of sessions for us. We do a virtual book club as well. And Damien, we studied one of Damien's books, and then he kindly guested at that forum as well. So I'm going to rattle through a few questions here, Steve. They're coming in. How has your business changed during the last 2 years? How have your colleagues handled it? So that's from Rachel here in Brisbane.
So Rachel, we were always kind of quite good with with tech, I suppose, and teams and that type of stuff. So for us, it was a bit of an evolution. So we had 20 staff based in Liverpool, and the rest of them were based around the UK. And we've continued. I think on average, we probably have 1 or 2 people in our office, which is seems a bit of a waste of space. But I suppose we're biding our time to see what that is going to look like in 6 months' time. In the last 2 years, it's created us huge opportunities because so I live in a little place called Formby in Liverpool, which is just on the coast north of Liverpool, and I very rarely leave Formby now. I mean, I used to be in London every other week. So the geographical boundaries that I have are really, really tight. But what things have done in the last 2 years, it's opened up the geographical boundaries. So we have one of our programs called Change Catalyst, which typically we'd have 75 senior leaders in the Olympic Park in London. So to go on the course, you have to go on the red eye and you have to stay over, and and you're limited to 75 people, etc., etc. Now we have delegates joining us from the Middle East, from America, from all over Europe, and the price point is half what it was, and our margins are bigger. So just little opportunities like that have been huge, and it's interesting because who would have thought 2 years ago that I was on a call with Andy and Phil on Monday, and you go from that to a call in Birmingham, then to a call in Mansfield, then to a call in London, and then I finished off the day with a call with a technology company in New York. It's kind of as opposed to changing trains in Crewe, right? So so dramatically, and for the better.
And Lisa's asked the next question, which is kind of an extension of that, but specifically around the world of learning. And you've answered a big part of that with what you said, but this maybe is the moment when you lift your VR goggles, Steve. But the world of learning changed dramatically in the last 18 months. What do you see as being the biggest positive, and what's the biggest opportunity still to be taken advantage of?
So for me, I look at exponential curves. Right, so you look at technology, the way it grows, and there's something called Moore's law, and Moore's law says that over every 2 years, the amount of components in a computer chip doubles. So computer power doubles over 2 years, and exponential technologies follow Moore's law. And what Moore's law means is that if we grow in a linear fashion, so typically businesses will go, next year I'm going to do 10% growth, 12% growth, 10% growth, 12%. If I take 30 linear steps forward in growth, it'll get me from here to the back of my garden, yeah? If I take 30 exponential doubling steps, i.e. first step is 1, next step is 2, next step is 4, next step is 8, next step is 16, 32, 64, and onwards like that. 30 steps takes me 26 times around the world. Right, so when you start to think in an exponential way about things, and 2004, when we started off, early stages of LMS systems and online learning, and we were following this straight line curve with gradual improvements over it. Last 2 years, we've started on the exponential curve, right? So I had a conversation with so one of the things that I use all the time, I've got them here. So where for us, we use virtual reality. So we've just rolled this out with our leadership team. And I had a conversation with a girl from, I won't mention the company, but it's a company that we're going to be launching some elements with and partnering with. They're in New York. And for me, we've always used augmented reality, but virtual reality is really different, because when people think about learning a virtual reality, you think about scenario-based learning, presentation skills, feedback, coaching, that type of stuff. Or how you learn to put something somewhere, or health and safety. The biggest evolution for me is in collaboration, collaborative learning in a virtual world. So if I can meet with Andy in a virtual space, in the most amazing environment, the most inspirational environment, but I'm sat here and I'm next to him and I can high five him, I can speak to him, and I can pull up a 50-foot screen rather than looking at a laptop. I can immediately pull up a video from the web. I can draw in and move around it and manipulate it and make it bigger. I can pull in somebody else into that space who can come and join us. I can immediately change the environment at the flick of a switch. Well, you can do that now, and that's what we do. One of the challenges is around the hardware, but if you think about the exponential curve and you go, okay, so the company I was speaking to on Monday or Tuesday, prior to COVID, the only way that you could run this collaboration software that I'm talking about that does all the things that I've just talked about, you had to run it on a £3,500 headset that was plugged into a gaming computer. That's £300. And you can now do it on that. So if we look at the exponential curve, and we go, look at the money that's been invested in technology at the moment. Look at the market value of your Zooms, your Teams, all this great technology, and you think, for us, we're already at the stage where new starters will get a laptop and a VR headset, but let's fast forward this to 2 years, and let's think about learning, and let's think about, well, if we can collaborate without moving, if we don't have to, but we can still get the feeling of being in a space together. A physical 3D space, which is super rich and actually better than any training room that you could ever be in. And it is better than any training room you can ever be in. Then why would you go to a training room? If you can have a 50-foot screen, if you can do all this, if you can manipulate stuff, and you can collaborate in real time. So that's where I think the future of learners, and that's what we'll be starting to roll out. We've got a planning day on Friday where we got 13 of our team on the whole day, spending on these, working on the logistical challenges around how do we roll this out to our clients.
Absolutely brilliant. And if you're in project management or so many other different disciplines, that same level of thinking applies to me, Steve. I think that's just absolutely phenomenal. This is going to have to be our last question, and then I'm going to kind of combine the question from Paul and the question from Malcolm, which is a combination of, in the current climate, how are you managing mental health of your teams? Paul's down in Melbourne, Sydney down here is in their 8th week of an intense lockdown. Melbourne's in their 6th lockdown. And then Malcolm then talks about, what are your top 3 tips for managing remotely in this new virtual world? So anything around mental health, stroke, managing remotely for those perhaps who've not yet invested in VR technology.
Yeah, I mean, just be visible. Just be visible as much as possible. I mean, we're a very fortunate company. So our team have access to a session every month with a speaker, and it's not compulsory that they do it. But it's interesting because it's become so much cheaper to be able to do it. Because and you become so agile. So just being responsive to that, So I'd say the first thing is, regular get-togethers, making people visible, turning on cameras, people seeing people face to face. We're doing we've got a really, good HR team is one of them, but James is great. Always sending out, things, little gifts, doing little pieces, team building events, just all the usual stuff that you couldn't, was more of a pain in the arse to sort when it was face to face, but there's no issue virtually now. So in terms of managing the mental health of people, top 3 tips, I haven't really got top 3 tips, but certainly being visible is a big one. There's so many resources out there, for people to watch, people to understand. We have, if people do need to talk, we support them with, paying for counsellors and that type of stuff. We're very, it's always been huge on our agenda anyway, because many of our teams suffer with mental health challenges, and that's the way it is. That's just the way of them, businesses are. So we just try and support as much as we possibly can. And the challenge is that the whole range of illness is huge. You can only do what you can do. It's but yeah, we just try and create a safe environment. Try and create an environment where people can talk. And if that's one of the big things, again going back to Steve Peters' book, you've got to allow your team the opportunity to have a rant, to let things out, to get things off the chest as well. I every morning, every night, I speak to one of my business partners, and I can guarantee you on either the morning or the night, one of us will say, I just need to let my chimp out. I know that I know I'm being irrational, but I just need to have a rant. And once you have that rant, problem halved, problem shared, it's gone, right? I can focus logically again. My chimp's talked, it's had a rant, it's done its stuff. And having that commonality of language, so that sometimes that, well, actually, it's not them, it's the chimp. Let them have a rant and then move on.
Brilliant. Steve, we've really got to draw it to a close there. First of all, I want to thank Phil. And I'd love to invite any of the members to step forward and host one of these interviews. It's absolutely brilliant development. Phil will, Paul, who did the call obviously last week with Graham Arnold, the Socceroos coach, would also agree with that. So Phil, huge thanks. I know you put a lot of effort into having a look at Steve's background and searching through the Liverpool Echo, amongst other things, to see what you could come up with. Steve, it's been a real pleasure and a privilege. Awesome to connect with you again. There were so many superb messages in that. Anyone who wants to know more about Raise the Bar, obviously you can go and have a look at the website. Please do that. An amazing organisation that I hold in very high esteem, and as Phil articulated, an incredible set of values. And as Steve then said, these are lived every day. They're not just stuck to the wall, as we all know in certain corporates. So please do go and have a look at all things Raise the Bar. If you want to get in contact with Steve, for example, Lisa, in the role that you do, please, I'm very, very happy to facilitate that. So Steve, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I truly appreciate you coming on and supporting these calls. And wherever you are around the world, please do take care and keep winning. Thanks.
Good luck, everyone. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate that. Have a great day.